the 17 wagons. Having completed a journey that had spanned nearly 6 months and crossed over 1,000 miles of unforgiving terrain, came to a final, creaking halt, the weary exhalations of the oxen creating thick, transient clouds in the increasingly biting air. This specific tract of land on the Great Plains was not chosen for its beauty or its promise of immediate sustenance, but because it corresponded to a set of coordinates on a surveyor's map, a legal abstraction that now defined the entirety of their future. The decision to stop was not one of triumphant arrival, but of reluctant necessity. A collective acknowledgement that the season had turned decisively against them, and that to press onward would be to invite certain disaster. The landscape itself was a character in their unfolding drama, a vast, undulating sea of dormant brown grass that stretched to a horizon so distant it seemed to merge with the immense, pale sky. A persistent wind, unimpeded by any significant geographical feature for hundreds of miles, swept across the prairie, its constant, low moan, a perpetual reminder of their isolation and the formidable power of the nature they now had to contend with. The most alarming feature, or rather the lack thereof, was the complete absence of trees, a reality that had slowly dawned on them over the preceding weeks as the familiar woodlands of the East had receded into memory, replaced by this stark, open emptiness. This single environmental factor rendered all their previous plans for shelter obsolete as the conventional log cabin, the archetypal symbol of pioneer life for which many carried tools and rudimentary architectural plans, was simply not a viable option. The community's leadership, a small group of men respected for their experience and calm judgment, convened near the lead wagon, their faces etched with the fatigue of the journey and the weight of the decisions that now lay before them. The conversation was low and pragmatic, devoid of panic or despair, focusing instead on the singular, pressing issue of survival through the impending winter. The concept of a dugout, a subterranean dwelling carved from the earth itself, transitioned from a traveler's tale to an immediate, non-negotiable course of action. The primary task was to identify suitable locations for these shelters, a process that involved a careful and deliberate reading of the land's subtle topography. A gentle south-facing slope was the ideal, as it would provide a natural buffer against the relentless northern gales and would also maximize the minimal warmth and light offered by the low winter sun. Small groups of men fanned out across the designated settlement area, their boots crushing the brittle, frost-encrusted grass, their eyes scanning for the slight rises and swales that would best accommodate their planned excavations. They carried long iron rods, which they drove into the ground at intervals, testing the composition of the soil, hoping to find a deep, stable loam free from the large, immovable rocks that could halt their progress. The tools they possessed were rudimentary and few, well-worn spades, heavy pickaxes, and a handful of horse-drawn breaking plows, implements designed for turning fertile topsoil, not for engaging in the kind of major earth-moving that was now required. Their resources were limited to what they had carried with them in their wagons and the very earth beneath their feet. The thick prairie, sod with its incredibly dense and tangled root system, which would soon become their primary building material. An atmosphere of quiet, focused urgency settled over the small encampment as individual families began to demarcate the perimeters of their future homes, using wooden stakes and lengths of twine to outline rectangles of modest dimensions, typically no larger than 12 by 14 feet, the bare minimum required to shield a family from the elements. The first swing of the pickaxe against the frozen crust of the earth was a jarring, laborious act, with the ground resisting their efforts with unforgiving hardness. Yet the work commenced and continued with a steady, monotonous rhythm, a physical expression of their collective will to endure. There was no time for reflection or doubt. The demands of the present moment were absolute, dictating a routine of relentless physical exertion that began before sunrise and ended only when the last vestiges of daylight had been extinguished by the encroaching, frigid darkness of the prairie night, while the physical act of carving homes from the frozen earth consumed the settlers' days. A parallel and equally critical process was set in motion, one that involved paper, ink, and the formal mechanisms of governmental administration. The legitimacy of their presence and their claim to the 160 acres allotted to each family hinged upon the successful filing of legal documents at the nearest federal land office, an outpost of bureaucracy situated a difficult, multi-day ride away. This administrative necessity underscored the peculiar duality of their existence. They were engaged in a primal struggle for survival against the elements. Yet their actions were framed and ultimately validated by a distant, codified system of laws and regulations. A young man, selected for his endurance and his familiarity with navigation by compass and stars, was tasked with this crucial journey, carrying in a weathered leather satchel the collective legal aspirations of the entire community. Inside were crudely but carefully drawn plats of the settlement, each plot numbered and assigned to a head of household, the lines representing the invisible yet binding grid that the Homestead Act had superimposed upon the vast, untamed landscape. These maps were the product of the community's own surveyor, a man who had painstakingly measured out the claims using a Gunter's chain, a device of 100 interconnected links, its methodical application a small act of imposing order on the wildness. The accuracy of his measurements had been reviewed by a committee of elders, For any error in these initial documents could lead to disputes and legal challenges years later. A prospect that seemed distant yet was taken with the utmost seriousness. Accompanying the maps was a pouch containing the required filing fees, a modest sum of money that had been painstakingly pooled from the dwindling resources of each family. Each coin representing a tangible stake in a future that was, for now, little more than a promise. As their emissary rode east, the settlers continued their unceasing labor. The rhythmic thud of pickaxes and the scrape of shovels echoing across the small valley. The focus of their work shifted from mere excavation to the more nuanced craft of construction, using the very material they were displacing. The prairie sod, or Nebraska marble, as it was sometimes called, with a touch of grim irony, became their stone and mortar, utilizing a specialized breaking plow with a sharp, rolling coulter. They cut long, continuous strips of sod from the untouched prairie. These ribbons of earth, held together by the dense, fibrous root systems of buffalo grass and other native vegetation, were then sectioned into uniform blocks, typically 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and about 4 inches thick. The weight of these earthen bricks, often exceeding 50 pounds each, made the construction process a slow and arduous affair, requiring the coordinated effort of several individuals for the placement of each block. The front wall of the dugout, the only part fully exposed to the elements, was built with meticulous care, the sod blocks laid in an overlapping, interlocking pattern to enhance their structural integrity. The grass side was oriented downwards, a technique that was believed to encourage the roots to continue growing, weaving the individual blocks into a solid, almost monolithic structure over time. Spaces were left for a single doorway and, if lumber permitted, a small window. The frames for these openings, constructed from the wood of a carefully dismantled wagon box, every splinter of this precious material used with purpose and forethought. The roof was the most complex part of the structure, beginning with a central ridgepole, often the salvaged axle of a wagon, supported by 2 sturdy, upright posts. From this central beam, smaller poles or salvaged lumber were laid, upon which was placed a thick layer of brush, followed by a final, heavy layer of the same sod used for the walls, its weight compressing the layers beneath and creating a reasonably waterproof, if not entirely dry, ceiling. This entire process was a testament to ingenuity born of scarcity, a slow, methodical assembly of a human habitation from the most basic elements of the natural world. An act of creation unfolding against the backdrop of an impending winter that threatened to undo all their efforts. The completion of the basic structure, a sod-roofed cavern carved into the earth, marked not an end, but the beginning of a new and equally demanding phase of labor, focused on rendering the interior space habitable. The internal environment of the dugout was, in its raw state, little more than a damp, dark cavity, with walls of raw earth that were prone to crumbling and shedding fine particles of dust with every vibration. The initial task, therefore, was to stabilize and finish these surfaces, a process undertaken with a mixture of ingenuity and rudimentary materials. The women and older children were often tasked with this work, using hand trowels or flat pieces of salvaged wood to smooth the earthen walls, compacting the soil to create a firmer surface. In some cases, a thin plaster was created by mixing local clay with water and finely chopped prairie grass, which acted as a binding agent, and this mixture was then applied to the walls in a thin, even layer. Once dry, this clay plaster provided a cleaner, more stable surface that significantly reduced the constant problem of dust and loose soil. The floor, similarly, was composed of packed earth, and great effort was expended to make it as level and hard as possible. This was achieved through a laborious process of tamping, where heavy wooden blocks were repeatedly dropped onto the surface, followed by the application of water, which, upon drying, created a floor that was almost as hard as stone, though it remained susceptible to dampness seeping up from the ground below. To mitigate this pervasive damp, a precious resource was sometimes expended: the wooden planks from a wagon bed could be laid down in a small section of the dugout, typically around the area where the stove would be placed and food preparation would occur, creating a slightly raised, dry platform that offered a small measure of comfort and cleanliness in an otherwise subterranean environment. The installation of the cast iron stove was the single most critical element in the outfitting of the interior, representing the heart of the domestic space and the primary defense against the encroaching cold. These stoves, purchased at great expense at the journey's outset, were compact, efficient, and designed for precisely this kind of frontier existence. Placing the heavy stove required the strength of several men, who carefully maneuvered it into its designated position, ensuring it sat level on the packed turf floor. The most technically challenging aspect of the installation was the creation of a safe and functional chimney. A hole had to be carefully cut through the thick sod roof, a task requiring precision to avoid compromising the structural integrity of the entire dwelling. The stovepipe, a series of interlocking metal tubes, was then fed through this opening, extending several feet above the roofline to ensure a proper draft and to carry the smoke away from the living space. The point where the pipe passed through the roof was a critical juncture, as it represented a potential entry point for rain and melting snow. This opening was sealed with a combination of packed clay and additional pieces of sod, creating a tight, waterproof collar around the pipe With the stove in place, the dugout was transformed from a cold earthen hole into a potential home. It provided not only warmth, but also a means to cook food, boil water for sanitation, and dry, damp clothing. The small, flickering light, visible through its grate, offered a psychological comfort that was difficult to overstate. A small beacon of controlled fire against the vast, untamed darkness outside. The arrangement of the remaining interior space was an exercise in extreme practicality. Furniture, as it was traditionally known, was virtually non-existent. What little existed was either salvaged or crudely fashioned. Shipping crates that had once held supplies were now repurposed as tables, cupboards, or benches. Stools were fashioned from short lengths of timber left over from the framing of the door. Bedding consisted of mattresses sewn from canvas sacks and stuffed with dry prairie grass, which provided a surprising degree of insulation and comfort, though it required periodic replacement to prevent it from becoming compacted and damp. These pallets were typically arranged along the back wall of the dugout, the furthest point from the single door, to maximize warmth and create a distinct sleeping area. Storage was another significant challenge, and the earthen walls themselves provided the solution. Niches and shelves were carefully carved into the clay, creating recessed spaces for storing preserved foods, cooking utensils, tools, and the few personal belongings that had survived the long journey west, such as a family Bible, a few worn books, or a set of mending tools. Lighting remained a persistent issue, as the single small window, often covered with a sheet of greased paper rather than glass, allowed in only a meager amount of daylight, even at midday. After dark, the primary sources of light were the faint glow from the stove and the sparing use of tallow candles or a simple lard lamp, which cast long, dancing shadows upon the earthen walls, creating a perpetual state of twilight within the shelter. This dimly lit, self-contained world, with its constant smell of damp earth, wood smoke, and cooking food, was becoming the new reality for the pioneers. A confined universe that offered security at the cost of the open sky, with the rudimentary shelters completed, and the first snows beginning to dust the vast, brown landscape. The focus of the community shifted from construction to the establishment of the durable routines and social structures necessary for long-term survival. Life within the settlement quickly fell into a rhythm dictated not by the hands of a clock, but by the rising and setting of the sun and the unyielding demands of their new environment. The division of labor, a practice carried over from their previous lives, but now imbued with a far greater sense of urgency. Tea became more sharply defined. The men's responsibilities lay primarily outside the dugout, in the harsh, open expanse of the prairie. A significant portion of every day, weather permitting, was devoted to the relentless pursuit of fuel. The complete absence of timber forced them to rely on alternative sources, the most common of which were dried buffalo or cattle droppings, colloquially known as chips. Organized foraging parties would set out with wagons or large canvas sacks, scouring the surrounding prairie for this unlikely but effective fuel source, which burned hot and with surprisingly little odor. When chips were scarce, they resorted to twisting long prairie grass into tight, dense knots which could be burned in the stove. Although they were consumed far more quickly and required a constant effort to gather and prepare. Another critical task for the men was the care and protection of the remaining livestock. The oxen, horses, and milk cows represented a vital resource, their survival directly linked to that of the settlers. Crude, three-sided shelters with walls made of stacked sod were constructed near the dugouts to offer the animals some protection from the biting winds. Guarding the animals at night, often in shifts, was also necessary to protect them from the few predators, such as wolves, that roamed the plains. Hunting, while hoped for as a means to supplement their dwindling food stores, proved to be a difficult and often fruitless endeavor, as the large herds of bison had already been depleted in this region, and smaller game was scarce and elusive in the cold weather. Inside the dugouts, a separate but equally demanding economy of labor was managed by the women. Their world was confined to the small, dimly lit space of the shelter, and their work was a continuous cycle of tasks essential for the health and well-being of their families. Food preparation was the central activity of the day, a challenge that required careful planning and resourcefulness, with supplies from the journey being strictly rationed. Every meal was a calculated effort to provide maximum sustenance from minimal ingredients. Cornmeal, flour, salted pork, and dried beans formed the basis of their diet, and the women developed great skill in creating variations from these limited staples. Baking bread in a cast-iron Dutch oven nestled in the coals of the stove was a daily ritual, the smell of it filling the small space and offering a profound sense of domestic normalcy. Mending clothing was another perpetual task, as the harsh conditions and constant physical labor took a heavy toll on their limited wardrobes. Every scrap of fabric was saved, and clothes were patched and repatched until they were a complex tapestry of repairs. The management of water was a significant physical burden, as it had to be hauled by the bucketful from a communal well that the men had dug near the center of the settlement, a deep shaft that represented a major investment of their collective energy. Keeping the dugout clean was a constant battle against the pervasive dust and the ever-present threat of dampness, a struggle that was fundamental to preventing illness in the close quarters. Alongside these physical tasks, the women were also the primary caregivers for the children and the keepers of the community's social and cultural fabric. passing on stories and songs in the quiet evenings and overseeing the rudimentary education of their young. As these individual household routines solidified, a provisional form of community governance also began to emerge. The Council of Elders, an informal body composed of the heads of each family, met periodically to discuss matters of communal concern, such as the allocation of resources, the organization of guard duties, and the resolution of the minor disputes that inevitably arose in such close and stressful living conditions. Their decisions, reached through consensus, formed an unwritten code of conduct that governed the settlement, a framework of mutual obligation that was understood to be essential for their collective survival. This fragile social order, like the sod shelters themselves, was a direct response to the pressures of their environment, a human system of cooperation built to withstand the long, isolating winter that had now truly begun to descend upon them. The precarious balance of health within the sod-walled enclosures became a matter of constant, low-level vigilance, a pervasive undercurrent of concern that shaped the daily routines as much as the need for food or warmth. The dugout, while providing essential shelter from the wind and the lethal cold, was an environment that presented its own set of insidious threats to the well-being of its inhabitants. Chief among these was the persistent, inescapable dampness that seeped from the earthen walls and floor, a condition exacerbated by the condensation of human breath in the poorly ventilated space, which would often form as frost on the interior surfaces during the coldest nights. This pervasive moisture created a breeding ground for mildew and other ailments, and the effort to keep bedding and clothing dry was a relentless, often losing battle, requiring items to be constantly rotated near the small stove to be aired out, a process that filled the already cramped quarters with a steamy, musty odor. The air quality itself was a significant concern, as the single stove, while a source of life-giving heat, also produced a steady output of smoke and soot, and on days when the wind blew from a particular direction, a poor draft in the makeshift chimney could cause the smoke to back up, filling the dugout with an acrid haze that irritated the eyes and lungs, leading to persistent, hacking coughs, particularly among the very young and the elderly. The physical proximity in which the families lived, with multiple individuals sleeping, eating, and existing within a few hundred square feet, meant that any contagious illness could spread with alarming rapidity, transforming a minor cold into a community-wide affliction in a matter of days. There was a shared, unspoken fear of the more serious diseases that were known to plague frontier communities, such as diphtheria, typhoid, or pneumonia, for which they possessed no effective cure. And the appearance of a fever or a severe cough in one member of the family was a cause for immediate, though quietly managed, alarm in response to these ever-present threats. A disciplined regimen of sanitation and folk medicine was meticulously observed. A set of practices born from a combination of traditional knowledge and harsh experience. The boiling of all drinking water drawn from the communal well was a non-negotiable rule in every household, a simple preventative measure that was understood to be a primary defense against waterborne pathogens. Personal hygiene was maintained through the sparing use of lye soap, a harsh but effective cleaning agent that the women produced themselves through the laborious process of leaching lye from wood ashes and combining it with rendered animal fat. While full baths were an impossibility in the depths of winter, regular washing of hands and faces was insisted upon, a ritual of cleanliness that provided a small measure of dignity and control amidst the earthen squalor. Each family possessed a small medical chest, a treasured item that had been carefully provisioned before their departure, containing a limited supply of basic remedies such as castor oil, a purgative, quinine for the treatment of fevers, and carbolic acid, a potent disinfectant used for cleaning wounds. These were supplemented by a collection of dried herbs and botanicals that the women had gathered and preserved. Knowledge passed down through generations. Peppermint was used to soothe upset stomachs. Horehound was brewed into a syrup to quiet coughs, and chamomile was steeped to make a calming tea to encourage rest. The application of these remedies was a solemn, ritualized affair, carried out with a quiet confidence that belied the often limited efficacy of the treatments themselves. When illness did take hold, the sick individual was isolated as much as possible within the single room, often being given the warmest sleeping spot nearest the stove, and was attended to with a quiet, focused intensity. The observation of symptoms was constant, with every change in breathing, temperature, or disposition being carefully noted, as these subtle shifts were the only diagnostic tools available. The psychological toll of nursing a sick family member in such a confined and helpless situation was immense, a silent weight of anxiety that settled upon the entire household. Yet it was borne with the same stoic endurance that characterized all other aspects of their existence. The prevention of illness was therefore not merely a practical concern, but an essential component of their strategy for survival. A constant, low-intensity war waged with soap, boiling water, and traditional remedies against the invisible enemies that thrived in the dark, damp corners of their subterranean world. As the winter deepened, burying the prairie under a uniform and seemingly endless blanket of white, the physical confinement of the dugout began to exert a profound and subtle pressure on the four. The psychological state of the pioneers, a slow erosion of spirit that was as dangerous as the cold itself. The initial sense of novelty and the urgent focus on construction and preparation gave way to a monotonous and unchanging routine, where one day blurred into the next, with little to distinguish them, save for the shifting patterns of the wind or the varying intensity of the snowfall. The world outside the single, greased paper window became an abstract and hostile expanse of white and gray, a place of lethal, cold, and blinding light from which they were almost completely disconnected. For days, and sometimes weeks at a time, during the most severe blizzards, the settlers would be completely sealed within their earthen homes, the doorway blocked by deep, impassable drifts of snow. During these periods, the only connection to the outside world was the thin column of smoke rising from their stovepipes, a fragile signal to their unseen neighbors that they were still present, still enduring. This extreme isolation led to a profound alteration in the perception of time, which seemed to lose its familiar, linear progression, stretching and compressing in unpredictable ways, measured not by hours or minutes, but by the small, recurring tasks of their daily existence: stoking the fire, preparing a meal, mending a garment. The sensory environment of the dugout was intensely limited and repetitive, a world composed of the perpetual twilight of the interior, the constant, low murmur of the wind outside, the crackle and pop of the fire in the stove, and the familiar, close-sought hand sounds of family members breathing, coughing, or moving within the small space. This prolonged sensory deprivation and the lack of personal space inevitably led to a condition that would later be termed cabin fever, a state of heightened irritability, lethargy, and quiet desperation. Tempers, normally held in check by the strictures of community and the demands of hard labor, could become frayed by the incessant, close proximity to others, and minor annoyances could magnify into significant sources of friction. A crossword, a child's incessant crying, or a disagreement over the rationing of a particular food item could create a palpable tension within the dugout that, with nowhere to dissipate, would linger in the air for days. Individuals would retreat into a silent, internal world, their faces becoming blank masks that betrayed none of the emotional turmoil within. To counteract this slow descent into despair and interpersonal conflict, the pioneers relied on the simple, time-honored traditions that provided structure and meaning to their lives. The act of storytelling became a vital form of entertainment and cultural preservation, with the elders recounting tales of their own pasts, of the lands they had left behind or familiar, well-worn folk tales that carried moral lessons and a sense of connection to a larger human experience. The singing of hymns, their somber, resonant melodies filling the small space, served not only as an expression of faith, but also as a means of creating a sense of communal harmony and shared purpose, a reminder that they were not alone in their struggle. The women would engage in intricate needlework or knitting. The repetitive, focused motions of their hands, a meditative act that produced tangible and useful results. While the men might pass the time by carving small objects from scarce pieces of wood, a toy for a child, a new handle for a tool-each finished item, a small victory against the overwhelming idleness. The family Bible was often the only book in the household, and the ritual of reading a passage aloud each evening was a central event, its ancient, formal language providing a sense of order and a connection to a reality that transcended their immediate, difficult circumstances. These small acts of creativity, faith, and social connection were not mere pastimes, but essential tools of psychological survival, a conscious and determined effort to maintain their humanity and their sanity against the crushing weight of the long, dark, and silent winter, the methodical routines established to preserve psychological equilibrium were themselves underpinned by a far more tangible and unforgiving system of accounting, one that governed the finite and dwindling supply of provisions stored within the dark corners of each dugout. The management of these resources was not a casual affair, but a rigorous, almost ritualistic discipline, a constant and silent conversation with the specter of starvation that loomed over the long winter months. At the heart of this system was the inventory, a periodic and solemn assessment of every edible item the family possessed. This task was typically undertaken by the head of the household, often with the assistance of their spouse. In the dim light of a lard lamp or the meager daylight that filtered through the small window, it was a process carried out with a quiet, focused gravity, as each sack, barrel, and crate was opened and its contents examined and measured. There were no written ledgers, as paper was a scarce commodity and literacy was not universal. Instead, the record was kept through more rudimentary but equally effective means. A smoothed plank of wood salvaged from a wagon, or the interior of a crate lid, served as the account book, upon which a series of notches and symbols were carved to represent the quantities of each staple. A long line of vertical notches might represent the remaining pounds of flour, with a new notch being scraped away or crossed out at the end of each week, providing a stark and constantly updated visual representation of their diminishing wealth. Another section of the plank would be dedicated to the salted pork or beef. The number of remaining pieces carefully counted and recorded. Cornmeal, dried beans, and potatoes, if they had been fortunate enough to harvest any before the ground froze, were all tracked with similar METICULOUSNESS. Beyond these basic staples were the commodities that provided not just sustenance, but a measure of comfort and morale. And these were guarded and rationed with even greater care. Salt, a substance more valuable than flour by weight, was essential not only for flavoring, but for the preservation of any meat that might be acquired through a rare hunting success, and for the health of both the family and their livestock. Its use was carefully monitored, each spoonful a deliberate allocation. Sugar, which had been purchased in cones wrapped in blue paper, was an almost unimaginable luxury. Used sparingly to sweetify a morning cup of coffee or to create a special treat for a child on a particularly bleak day. The chipping away of a small piece from the hard cone, a significant event. Coffee beans, roasted and ground by hand in a small iron mill, were another precious resource, their stimulating and warming properties making them a vital part of the morning ritual, a small act of normalcy that helped to fortify the spirit against the day ahead. The rationing of these supplies was a science of fractions and careful estimation, often using a single designated tin cup as a standard unit of measurement. The daily portion of flour for each family member was measured with a precision that bordered on the reverential. This daily dole was the basis of their survival, and the process was repeated with the same unvarying exactitude day after day, a monotonous but essential rhythm. This extreme thrift extended to every object within the dugout, creating a closed-loop economy where nothing was ever truly discarded. A worn-out wool shirt beyond patching would be unraveled, its yarn respun and reknitted into mittens or a child's stocking. A broken metal tool was not thrown away, but carefully set aside, its components saved for a time when the small forge could be fired up to repair another implement or to fashion a new nail or hook. The sturdy cloth sacks in which the flour and cornmeal had been transported were washed and then painstakingly unstitched, the resulting pieces of fabric becoming the material for children's clothing, patches, or bedding. Even the smallest scraps were saved, collected in a bag to be used as tinder for the fire or as stuffing for a small pillow. This culture of absolute conservation was not an intellectual choice, but a simple, unyielding necessity, a fundamental law of their existence, where waste was a concept that was not only unaffordable, but almost unthinkable. The notched plank, with its ever-shrinking record of their provisions, was a silent and constant companion in the dugout, a tangible reminder of the slow, inexorable passage of time and the finite nature of the resources that sustained them against the unceasing cold, the internal economy of each household, with its strict rationing and meticulous conservation, was mirrored by an external economy of social interaction and mutual obligation that connected the scattered and half-buried dwellings into a cohesive, functioning community. The physical separation of the dugouts, each a small island of warmth and light in the vast, snow-covered landscape, necessitated the creation of deliberate and often laborious methods of maintaining contact. Following a significant snowfall, the first order of communal business was the excavation of pathways, a task undertaken by the men of the settlement working in coordinated teams. Using their broad-bladed shovels, they would carve deep trenches through the accumulated drifts, creating a network of sunken corridors that linked the doorway of each dugout to its neighbors and to the centrally located well. These snow canyons, with walls sometimes rising higher than a man's head, were more than mere conveniences. They were the essential arteries of the community, the physical manifestation of their interconnectedness, allowing for the passage of information, the sharing of resources, and the rendering of aid in an emergency. A visit to another family was never a casual undertaking, but a purposeful act, often preceded by a brief period of observation to ensure that the timing was opportune. The purpose of such visits was almost always practical: to borrow a tool, to share news of a successful hunt, to seek advice on the treatment of an illness, or to deliver a small portion of a freshly baked loaf of bread, a simple gesture that reaffirmed the bonds of neighborly reciprocity. The etiquette of these interactions was unwritten but universally understood, a blend of frontier formality and genuine concern. News was exchanged in a calm, measured fashion, with an emphasis on factual information rather than idle gossip, as every piece of intelligence observations about the weather, the tracks of animals seen in the snow, the health of the livestock was potentially valuable to the survival of the group. This system of mutual support was governed by an unspoken social ledger, a complex and constantly adjusting calculus of debts and credits that was maintained in the collective memory of the community. If a family required assistance in retrieving a stray cow or repairing a broken wagon wheel, their neighbors would provide it without question and without any expectation of immediate payment. It was understood, however, that a debt had been incurred, and that when the opportunity arose, they would be expected to repay it in kind, offering their own labor, a share of their resources, or their particular skills to whoever in the community might need them. This principle of reciprocity was the glue that held the settlement together, a more powerful force than any formal set of laws. The adjudication of this social contract and the handling of any larger issues that affected the entire community fell to the informal council of elders. This body, composed of the male heads of each household, would convene as needed, typically in the largest and most centrally located dugout, to deliberate on matters of communal importance. Their proceedings were serious and democratic, with each man given the opportunity to speak his mind, and decisions were reached not by a formal vote, but through a process of consensus building. The topics of discussion were invariably practical. Organizing a rotating night watch for the livestock after wolves were heard howling nearby. Planning a collective effort to deepen the well, or mediating a rare dispute between two families over the boundary of a hay-cutting area. The authority of this council was not derived from any legal document, but from the respect that its members had earned through their experience, wisdom, and demonstrated commitment to the common good. Their rulings were enforced by the powerful sanction of community opinion. As to be ostracized in such an isolated and interdependent environment was a fate that no settler could afford to risk. This fragile but functional civic structure, with its network of snow-walled pathways and its unwritten code of mutual obligation, was as essential to their survival as the sod roofs over their heads. A human system of order imposed upon a landscape that was fundamentally defined by its vastness and its indifference to their continued existence. The unwritten social ledger that governed the interactions between the settlers was a closed system, entirely sufficient for the internal management of the community, yet it existed in parallel to another, more formal system of record-keeping that was slowly and intermittently taking note of their existence. Sometime after the turn of the year, when the winter had reached its deepest and most unforgiving stage, a lone figure on horseback was spotted, moving slowly across the immense frozen expanse. His dark form, a stark and solitary intrusion upon the uniform whiteness of the landscape. This was a representative from the Territorial Land Office, a circuit agent whose duties included the periodic inspection of new claims to ensure that the stipulations of the Homestead Act were being met, a process known as proving up. His arrival was not a social call, but an official and unsentimental assessment, a bureaucratic audit of their struggle for survival. The agent, a man of middle years with a face weathered by countless such journeys, conducted his work with a detached and methodical efficiency. He carried with him a large, leather-bound field book, its pages filled with neat columns and grids, and a set of surveyor's instruments that he used to verify the claim. Boundaries against the official government plats that he carried in an oilskin pouch. He moved from one dugout to the next, his demeanor polite but distant, asking a series of standardized questions in a flat, unemotional tone. His inquiries were not concerned with the settlers' comfort or their hardships, but with the quantifiable evidence of their improvements to the land. He noted the precise dimensions of each excavated dwelling, calculating the cubic feet of earth that had been moved, an act of labor that he recorded as a tangible capital improvement. He inspected the crude sod-walled shelters that had been erected for the livestock, noting their construction and capacity. He meticulously counted the number of acres that had been broken by the plow before the frost had set in. Even though the furrows were now buried under several feet of snow, relying on the testimony of the settlers and his own experienced judgment to make the estimation, the agent's field book became a dispassionate, numerical representation of the community's entire existence. He recorded the population of each household divided into columns for adult males, adult females, and children under the age of 16. He made a careful inventory of their livestock, noting the number of oxen, horses, milk cows, and chickens, and making a summary judgment on their general health and condition. He inquired about their water source, inspecting the communal well and noting its depth and the quality of its construction. He even made a note of the fuel source, recording the settlers' reliance on buffalo chips and twisted grass as a data point relevant to the long-term viability of a settlement in a timber-scarce region. The interior of the dugout was also subject to his quiet scrutiny. He observed the cast-iron stoves, the salvaged lumber furniture, and the general state of order within the confined spaces, his observations being translated into brief, coded remarks in his ledger that signified compliance with the residency requirements of the law. He was not there to offer aid or sympathy, but to gather facts, to transform the complex and difficult reality of their lives into a set of data that could be transmitted back to the territorial capital and entered into the permanent record. His assessment was fundamentally economic, a calculation of whether the human and capital investment on this particular piece of the grid was likely to yield a productive return for the nation. The settlers, for their part, understood the nature of his visit and cooperated fully, answering his questions with a simple, factual directness that mirrored his own demeanor. They knew that his final report would be a critical document, the official testimony that would one day secure their legal title to the land they now occupied. And so they presented their meager improvements with a quiet dignity, allowing their labor to speak for itself. After 2 days of methodical inspection, the agent concluded his work. He made a final series of entries in his field book, drank a cup of coffee offered to him in the dugout of the community's elder, and then, with a brief and formal nod of farewell, he mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing back into the vast, indifferent whiteness from which he had emerged, leaving behind a silence that was now filled with the unspoken weight of his official judgment. His future report, which would be filed weeks later and stored in a dusty archive, would describe the settlement as marginal but viable, noting the considerable industry of the inhabitants in the construction of subterranean dwellings, and concluding that, contingent upon a favorable spring planting season, the claim holders were in substantial compliance with the terms of the Act, while the formal, external assessment of the settlement was being conducted and recorded through the dispassionate lens of bureaucratic procedure. The internal and informal education of the community's youngest members proceeded, according to its own distinct and unwritten curriculum, a pedagogy shaped by the unique constraints and demands of their subterranean environment. The world for a child in that lost winter was not the vast, open prairie, but the dimly lit, earth-scented confines of the dugout, a space of no more than 200 square feet that constituted the entire sensory universe for weeks at a time. Their education was, by necessity, a blend of practical apprenticeship and rote memorization, a process designed to instill the skills and the discipline required for their continued survival. Formal schooling, in the conventional sense, was a sporadic and rudimentary affair. There were no designated schoolhouses, no professionally trained teachers, and only a handful of books in the entire settlement. Instruction was typically undertaken by one of the mothers, who would gather the children from several neighboring families into a single dugout for a few hours each day. The core of the curriculum was basic literacy and numeracy, taught with the most meager of resources. The primary text was often the family Bible, from which the children learned to recognize the letters of the alphabet and to sound out simple words, their small fingers tracing the solemn, archaic verses. Slate boards were a rare luxury. More often, letters and numbers were drawn with a charred stick onto the back of a wooden crate lid, or scratched into a patch of smoothed, dried clay on the floor, to be wiped away and reused the following day. Arithmetic was taught through practical, tangible examples that related directly to their daily existence. The counting of potatoes, the division of a loaf of bread, the calculation of the number of days until the spring thaw might reasonably be expected. This academic instruction, however, formed only a small part of their learning. The more significant portion of their education was absorbed through their active participation in the constant, labor-intensive work of the household. Children were not shielded from the realities of their situation, but were integrated into the domestic economy from a very young age. Their tasks assigned according to their strength and maturity. The smallest children were given the responsibility of keeping the kindling box next to the stove filled with twisted knots of prairie grass or carefully selected buffalo chips, a simple but vital chore. As they grew older, their responsibilities expanded. They learned to haul buckets of snow into the dugout to be melted for water, a task that required repeated trips into the cold and a careful avoidance of waste. They were taught the meticulous and repetitive work of carding wool, preparing it to be spun into yarn, and the proper way to churn cream into butter in a small wooden dash churn. They learned to mend their own clothing with a needle and thread, a skill that was considered as fundamental as reading. The games they played were likewise a reflection of their confined and resource-scarce environment. There were no manufactured toys. Instead, their playthings were objects of their own or their parents' creation. Dolls were fashioned from corn husks, their hair made from strands of unraveled twine. Small animal figures were carved from scraps of wood or molded from clay dug from the dugout walls. Games of checkers or other simple board games were played on boards scratched into a piece of wood using dried beans or small, smooth stones as the playing pieces. These activities, while providing a necessary diversion, also served to develop manual dexterity and strategic thinking, skills that had a direct application to the challenges of their lives. The children's understanding of the world was shaped by the stories they heard from the elders in the long, dark evenings, tales that were a mixture of family history, religious parables, and folklore, which together formed the moral and cultural framework of their community. Their physical world was one of confined spaces and limited horizons, but their imaginative world, nurtured by these oral traditions, was vast and unbounded. This unique and severe upbringing produced a generation that was resilient, resourceful, and profoundly self-reliant, their characters forged in the quiet, monotonous, and demanding crucible of the dugout, an education that prepared them not for a world of abstract ideas, but for a life of tangible work and constant adaptation. Amidst the collective and communal narrative of survival, there exist a few fragile, isolated records that offer a more granular, though equally dispassionate, account of the daily realities within the subterranean dwellings. These are not formal journals or diaries, for the materials required for such consistent record-keeping were a luxury that few possessed, but rather a small collection of preserved letters written intermittently on mismatched scraps of paper with ink made from a mixture of soot and water. The very act of composing these letters was a significant undertaking, an event that required the careful hoarding of resources and the seizing of a rare moment of sufficient light and relative quiet. The author of one such collection, a woman, whose name has been lost to the administrative anonymity of the era, directed her correspondence to a sister who remained in the comparatively civilized and comfortable environment of the East. These letters, which were entrusted to the rare traveler or government agent passing through the territory, were not filled with emotional outpourings or dramatic descriptions of hardship, but with a calm, methodical cataloging of the facts of her new existence, a kind of domestic ledger intended to inform rather than to alarm. Through her sparse and pragmatic prose, a detailed picture of the household economy emerges, one that corroborates and deepens the broader understanding of the settler's condition. She writes of the weekly flour ration, specifying the number of cups allocated to each family member and notes the precise date on which a particular sack of cornmeal was opened, a detail that speaks volumes about the meticulous mental accounting that was a constant preoccupation. The letters provide a quiet, ongoing commentary on the integrity of the dugout itself, which she refers to not as a home, but as the habitation or our winter quarters. She notes the persistent dampness in the north corner, a problem that she attempts to mitigate by rotating the placement of their bedding, and she records the dates of minor structural events, such as a small section of the earthen wall crumbling inward, or the discovery of a hibernating snake in the sod of the ceiling. Incidents that are reported with the same factual tone as a weather observation. The health of her children is a recurring topic, but it is discussed in the detached language of a clinical report. A child's cough is not a source of expressed anxiety, but a condition that has persisted for a noted number of weeks. Its severity measured by the amount of sleep it interrupts. She details the remedies that have been applied: a syrup of horehound and honey, a poultice of rendered lard and turpentine on the chest stand records their apparent effects, or lack thereof, with an impartial observer's precision. The endless cycle of work that define her days is also a subject of this correspondence, but she describes it not in terms of drudgery, but as a series of necessary and unending processes. The mending of a garment is detailed by the type of fabric used for the patch and the number of hours the repair required. The preparation of a meal is described by its ingredients and the method of cooking, a small but significant record of their monotonous but life-sustaining diet. The value of these letters lies not in what they state overtly, but in the world they reveal through their careful accumulation of mundane detail. The profound isolation of their lives is not lamented, but is evident in her repeated requests for news from the outside world, and in the long intervals between the dates of her correspondence, intervals that she explains are due to a lack of paper or a suitable opportunity to send a dispatch. The letters, when viewed as a single, continuous document, become a testament to the human impulse to record, to create order, and to maintain connection, even in the most constrained and challenging of circumstances. They are the fragile, ink-stained artifacts of a mind that sought to impose the logic of a ledger upon the chaotic and overwhelming reality of a winter spent beneath the frozen surface of the earth. The human world, with its meticulously rationed existence and its carefully managed social interactions, was a small and fragile imposition upon a much larger and more powerful reality, the physical environment of the prairie winter itself, an ecosystem that operated according to its own ancient and indifferent rhythms. For the settlers, confined for long periods within their dugouts. The outside world was experienced not as a landscape to be traversed, but as a collection of sensory data, a series of phenomena to be observed, interpreted, and endured. The snow, the primary and defining element of this environment, was not a single, uniform substance, but a complex and ever-changing medium. There was the fine, dry powder that fell during periods of intense cold, a form of precipitation so light that it would be driven by the wind into every conceivable crack and crevice, sometimes accumulating in a fine, glittering dust on the floor, just inside the poorly sealed door of the dugout. Then there was the heavy, wet snow that fell when temperatures hovered near the freezing point, a substance that clung to every surface and accumulated with a formidable weight that could threaten the structural integrity of the sod roofs, prompting the men to venture out with their shovels to clear the heavy load. After a period of thaw, however brief, followed by a hard refreeze, the surface of the snowpack would transform into a thick, unforgiving crust of ice, a glittering sheet that made walking treacherous, but that also provided a hard surface upon which predators, such as the lean and desperate coyotes, could travel with greater ease their distant, yipping cries carrying with a startling clarity on the cold, dense night air. The wind was the other constant and active agent in this environment, a force that was not merely heard, but felt as a physical pressure against the front walls of the dugouts. It was the wind that sculpted the snow into the massive, undulating drifts that could block a doorway in a matter of hours, and it was the wind that scoured the exposed ridges of the prairie bare, revealing the frozen brown stubble of the dormant grass beneath. The settlers learned to read the sound of the wind as it moved across the vast, open spaces. A low, steady moan from the north was the sound of deep and enduring cold, while a higher-pitched, whistling sound often presaged a new and more violent storm. The animal life of the prairie had largely vanished into hibernation or had migrated to more sheltered regions, and this profound biological silence was another defining characteristic of the deep winter. The vast, noisy flocks of birds that had filled the skies during the autumn were gone, replaced by a profound and almost absolute quiet, broken only by the sound of the wind. Yet signs of life persisted for those with the patience to observe them. The tracks of a jackrabbit in the fresh snow, a delicate, dotted line leading from one sparse patch of brush to another, was a subject of intense interest, a sign that there was still game to be had, however elusive. A small hole in the snowpack, with a faint plume of vapor rising from it, might indicate the breathing hole of a badger in its den deep below the frost line. On rare occasions, a solitary snowy owl, a silent, white visitor from the far north, might be seen perched on one of the wooden posts that marked a claim boundary, its head swiveling in a slow, patient arc as it surveyed the white desolation for the slightest sign of movement from a mouse or a vole moving in its tunnels beneath the snow. The cold itself was a tangible presence, a force that altered the physical properties of the world. The iron heads of the axes and pickaxes became brittle in the extreme temperatures and could shatter, like glass if struck against the frozen ground with too much force. A catastrophic failure for a community with no means of replacement. The water in the buckets, even when kept just inside the doorway of the dugout, would quickly form a thick skin of ice, and the communal well required a concerted effort each morning to break through the frozen layer that had formed overnight. The sky, on the clear, windless days that often followed a major storm, was a brilliant and almost painful blue, and at night, with no competing light for hundreds of miles, it became a vast black dome filled with an astonishing density of cold, glittering stars. A sight of immense and impersonal beauty that served as a constant and humbling reminder of the sheer scale of the wilderness in which their small, struggling community was embedded. The slow, grinding monotony of the deep winter was unexpectedly and violently interrupted not by a force of nature from without, but by a danger that had been nurtured and contained within the very heart of their domestic existence. The event began without a sound, as a slow, creeping accumulation of heat in the wooden roof timbers that were situated too close to the iron stovepipe in one of the centrally located dugouts. A flaw in construction born of haste and a lack of experience with the peculiar dynamics of subterranean heating. Over many weeks, the constant cycle of heating and cooling had slowly carbonized the wood, lowering its ignition point to a critical threshold, and on this particular night, a slightly hotter than usual fire, stoked with a particularly resinous piece of salvaged pine, provided the final increment of energy required for the chemical process to cross over into combustion. The first indication of the crisis was not a visible flame, but a subtle change in the quality of the air within the dwelling. A faint, acrid smell of scorching wood that was initially mistaken for a downdraft from the chimney. It was only when a thin wisp of smoke was observed curling down from the ceiling around the stovepipe's color of packed clay that the family understood the gravity of the situation. The reaction was immediate but devoid of panic, a testament to the discipline that their environment had instilled in them. The father, in a few swift movements, roused his sleeping wife and children, directing them towards the single exit with a low, firm voice, while he himself turned to grab a bucket of precious drinking water to dash against the smoldering ceiling. An act that produced a great hiss of steam, but did little to halt the slow, inexorable progress of the fire that was now burning within the dense, packed sod of the roof. The alarm was raised by the sight of an unnatural, flickering orange glow emanating from the stovepipe's exit on the surface of the snow-covered prairie. A silent beacon that was quickly spotted by a neighbor who had stepped outside for a moment. A single, powerful shout of fire cut through the immense silence of the winter night, a sound that carried with startling clarity in the cold, dense air and acted as an immediate summons to the entire community. From the doorways of the surrounding dugouts, figures began to emerge, pulling on boots and heavy coats as they ran, their movements urgent but coordinated, a spontaneous and unrehearsed mobilization of their collective strength. The men arrived carrying their shovels and axes, the primary tools of their existence, while the women followed with empty buckets, their purpose not to carry water. For there was no source readily available other than melted snow, but to aid in the removal of the family's possessions. The fire was not a roaring inferno, as it was starved of oxygen within the tightly packed earth and sod, but a stubborn, deep-seated smolder that was slowly consuming the roof from the inside out. The dry grass that was mixed in with the sod acting as a slow-burning fuse. The focus of the men's efforts was not to extinguish the fire with water, which they knew would be futile, but to deconstruct the roof ahead of the smoldering advance, to create a firebreak by tearing away the very structure that was fueling it. Using their axes, they chopped through the smaller wooden poles that supported the sod, while others used their shovels to frantically heave great quantities of snow onto the burning sections, the intense cold of the snow serving to rob the fire of its heat. The air filled with a thick, choking smoke and the hiss of melting snow. Minnie. The scene illuminated by the hellish internal glow of the burning roof and the cold, white light of the moon. Inside the dugout, the women worked with a swift and silent efficiency, passing household items out into the snow in a human chain bedding, clothing the precious sacks of flour and cornmeal, the cast iron pots, and pan-salvaging what they could from the smoke-filled interior, before the weakening roof threatened to collapse entirely. The process was a frantic but controlled race against time, a battle fought with the most rudimentary of tools against an elemental force. And within the space of an hour, the fire was largely subdued. The roof of the dugout, now a gaping, blackened chasm, open to the frigid night sky, its interior coated in a slurry of soot, ash, and melted snow, a complete and devastating loss of a family's entire world. The morning following the fire broke clear and intensely cold, the rising sun casting long, blue shadows across the snow and illuminating the scene of the previous night's disaster with a harsh and unforgiving clarity. The burned-out dugout was a black, gaping wound in the white landscape, its charred roof timbers stark against the sky, the interior a frozen, chaotic jumble of debris. The event had been a catastrophic loss for a single family, but it was immediately and instinctively understood by all as a communal crisis, a wound to the entire body of the settlement that required a collective and immediate response. Before the day's routine work of tending to livestock or hauling water began, the Council of Elders, the de facto governing body of the community, convened inside the largest of the undamaged dugouts. The mood was somber and pragmatic. The discussion focused not on assigning blame or lamenting the loss, but on the logistical and administrative challenge of managing the aftermath. The first and most pressing issue was the disposition of the displaced family, a household of 5 that was now without shelter, food, or any possessions beyond the nightclothes they had been wearing when they escaped the smoke. The solution was a practical and unsentimental division of the burden. The father and the eldest son would be housed with one neighboring family, while the mother and the 2 younger children would be taken in by another, a decision based on a cold calculation of available space and the ability of each household to absorb the additional strain on their resources. This arrangement was not a request, but a communal directive, accepted with a simple nod by the heads of the designated households. For the principle of mutual support was the unwritten and unbreakable law of their society. The second order of business was to address the material losses of the displaced family, a process that transformed the informal social ledger of reciprocity into a formal and binding system of redistribution. A complete inventory of the destruction was made based on the memory of the affected family, a verbal accounting of every lost sack of flour, every side of bacon, every blanket, and every essential tool. The council then levied a formal contribution upon every other household in the settlement, a kind of emergency tax paid not in currency but in kind. The assessment was calculated with a scrupulous fairness, each family being required to give a small but specific quantity of their own dwindling supplies, an amount proportional to their own household size and existing stores. The process of collection was a solemn and public ritual, with the head of each family bringing their allotted contribution, a carefully measured scoop of flour, a piece of salted pork cut from their own supply, a spare woolen shirt, a handful of nails to a central collection point. This act was not charity, but a fulfillment of a social contract, an investment in a system of collective insurance that they all knew they might one day need to draw upon themselves. The final and most daunting task addressed by the council was the plan for rebuilding. It was understood that the burned dugout had to be restored, as the crowding of 2 additional families into the already cramped existing shelters was not a sustainable solution. The labor for the reconstruction would be provided by all the men of the community, working in rotating shifts. The most difficult problem was the scarcity of materials, particularly the large timbers needed for the main roof beam and supports. After a brief but serious deliberation, a decision was made to sacrifice a secondary structure for the greater good, one of the communal livestock shelters, which was less critical to the immediate survival of the animals than the individual family dugouts, would be carefully dismantled, its precious wooden beams and posts repurposed for the reconstruction of the burned dwelling. This difficult trade-off calculated risk that placed the long-term well-being of the human inhabitants above the comfort of their animals was a stark illustration of the unforgiving calculus of survival that governed every aspect of their lives. A system where every decision was weighed against the ultimate and non-negotiable imperative of enduring the winter. The arduous process of rebuilding the fire-ravaged dugout began on the second day following the disaster, a collective endeavor that transformed the site of the loss into a focal point of communal labor and a stark demonstration of their interdependent existence. The first task was the grim and laborious clearing of the debris, a process that involved the systematic dismantling of what remained of the original structure. The men of the settlement, working in the biting cold under a pale and indifferent winter sun, used their shovels and gloved hands to remove the frozen slurry of ash, melted snow, and charred sod that filled the interior of the dugout. This material was hauled away in canvas sacks and wooden crates, its removal exposing the scorched earthen walls and the blackened crater of the collapsed roof. The salvageable elements were meticulously separated from the waste. The cast-iron stove, miraculously intact though coated in soot, was carefully hoisted from the pit and set aside for cleaning and inspection. Any pieces of the roof timbers that had not been completely consumed by the fire were saved, their charred ends being cut away with handsaws to yield shorter, but still usable lengths of wood that could be repurposed for framing or furniture. Even the nails, painstakingly recovered from the burned timbers, were collected in a tin can, their value magnified by the impossibility of acquiring replacements. This initial phase of the work was slow and disheartening, a physical confrontation with the extent of the destruction. Yet it was undertaken with a steady, almost silent resolve. The rhythmic scrape of the shovels and the crunch of boots on the frozen debris, the only sounds to break the stillness. Once the cavity of the dugout had been cleared down to its original packed earth floor, the process of reconstruction commenced, a careful and deliberate reversal of the deconstruction that had just been completed. The earthen walls, which had been partially scorched and rendered unstable by the heat of the fire, were the first to be addressed. Using their pickaxes and spades, the men scraped away the fire-hardened outer layer of clay, revealing the damp, stable earth beneath, and then reshaped and compacted the walls, restoring the integrity of the original excavation. The most significant phase of the project was the framing of the new roof, an act that relied upon the communal sacrifice of the dismantled livestock shelter. The long, heavy ridgepole and the main support posts, salvaged from that secondary structure, were carried to the site by teams of men and carefully maneuvered into position. Their placement a critical moment that determined the strength and stability of the entire dwelling. With the primary frame in place, the smaller roof joists, a combination of salvaged lumber and newly cut poles from a small, distant grove of willows that had been discovered along a frozen creek bed, were laid across the structure. The remainder of the construction followed the familiar, time-tested methods of their initial building efforts. A thick layer of prairie grass and brush was laid over the wooden frame, followed by the meticulous placement of freshly cut sod blocks, which had been harvested from a new patch of prairie. The neat, rectangular scars on the landscape, a testament to this second, unscheduled expenditure of the land's resources. The front wall of the dugout was rebuilt with a new door frame fashioned from the best of the salvaged wood, and the opening for the stovepipe was carefully reconstructed, this time with a wider collar of packed clay and stones to provide a more substantial fire break. A small but significant architectural modification born from the harsh lesson of the fire. The entire process, from the initial clearing of the debris to the final placement of the last sod block on the new roof, took nearly a week of relentless communal labor, a significant diversion of energy from the other essential tasks of winter survival. It was an investment not just in the restoration of a single family's shelter, but in the reaffirmation of the community's own resilience, a tangible and hard-won victory against the forces of dissolution that constantly threatened their small, isolated world. The immediate and all-consuming crisis of the fire, followed by the intensive, week-long effort of the communal rebuild, had a profound and unsettling effect on the delicate equilibrium of the settlement, introducing a new and pervasive element of anxiety into the collective psychology. The disaster had served as a brutal and tangible reminder of their profound vulnerability, shattering the fragile sense of security that the monotonous routines of the deep winter had ironically helped to foster. Before the fire, the primary threats had been perceived as external and chronic. The relentless cold, the scarcity of food, the ever-present possibility of illness. The fire, however, had been an internal and acute event, a catastrophe that had erupted from within the very heart of their domestic sanctuary, demonstrating that even their most carefully constructed defenses were fallible, and that disaster could be born from the familiar and essential elements of their own survival, such as the life-giving stove. This new awareness manifested itself in a subtle but noticeable shift in the behavior of the settlers, a heightened Almost obsessive attention was now paid to the daily maintenance and operation of their own stoves. The nightly ritual of banking the coals for the evening was no longer a routine task, but a careful, deliberate procedure, with each shovelful of ash being inspected for any stray embers. The accumulation of soot within the stovepipes, a previously minor annoyance, was now seen as a potential threat, and a new chore was added to the weekly routine. The cleaning of the pipes with a crude but effective brush made from a bundle of stiff prairie grass tied to a long pole. A new and unspoken rule of etiquette emerged, where it became acceptable for a neighbor to offer unsolicited advice or a word of caution regarding the operation of another family's stove, a level of intrusion into the private domestic sphere that would have been unthinkable before the fire. This generalized anxiety was compounded by the very real and quantifiable strain that the rebuilding effort had placed upon the community's finite resources. The unplanned expenditure of food to support the displaced family, the communal contribution of supplies, and the week-long diversion of labor from other essential tasks, such as hunting and gathering fuel, had left the entire settlement in a more precarious position than before. The carefully notched planks that served as their ledgers now told a more alarming story. The rate of depletion of their core supplies having accelerated noticeably. This shared sense of increased vulnerability had a dual and contradictory effect on the social fabric of the community. On one hand, it reinforced the absolute necessity of their interdependence, as the successful reconstruction of the dugout had been a powerful and undeniable demonstration of the strength of their collective action. The bonds of mutual obligation, forged in the shared labor of the rebuild, were stronger and more explicit than ever. On the other hand, the heightened awareness of their dwindling resources also created a new potential for internal friction. The allocation of the communally gathered supplies to the displaced family, while accepted by all as a necessity, was a transaction that was now recorded in the social ledger of every household, an unspoken debt that would need to be repaid in the future. A subtle sense of watchfulness entered into their interactions, a more careful assessment of whether each family was contributing its fair share to the common good, and not taking more than its rightful portion from the communal pot. The fire had burned away their complacency and replaced it with a more sober and anxious understanding of their situation, a recognition that their survival depended not only on their ability to withstand the external pressures of the environment, but also on their capacity to manage the internal stresses and fragilities of their own small and deeply interconnected society. The restored dugout stood as a monument to their resilience, but the memory of the fire left a permanent, invisible scar on the collective psyche of the settlement. The slow and almost imperceptible creep of the calendar toward the deepest point of the winter brought with it a new and insidious adversary, a foe that could not be battled with communal labor or contained by a rebuilt wall. For it was an enemy that resided within the very blood and bone of the settlers themselves. The physical and psychological reserves that had sustained them through the initial shock of their arrival. The arduous construction of the dugouts and the acute crisis of the fire had been slowly and systematically depleted, and the consequences of this long, attritional struggle were now beginning to manifest in the form of a profound and pervasive corporeal decline. This was not a specific, identifiable illness with a clear onset and a name, but rather a gradual, systemic fading, a dulling of the vital functions that was a direct result of a prolonged period of inadequate nutrition, unrelenting stress, and the almost complete absence of direct sunlight. The condition was most readily observable in a pervasive lethargy that settled over the community, a bone-deep weariness that was distinct from the simple fatigue of a day's hard labor. It was a state of being in which every physical movement, from lifting a bucket of water to rising from a sleeping pallet, seemed to require a conscious and significant expenditure of a dwindling supply of willpower. The men who had once swung their axes with a powerful and rhythmic efficiency now found that their muscles tired more quickly, that their swings were less certain, and that a task that would have taken an hour in the autumn now required the better part of an afternoon, punctuated by long periods of rest. The women engaged in the repetitive and unending tasks of the dugout found their movements becoming slower, more automatic, their minds drifting into a state of quiet apathy that was a necessary defense against the crushing monotony of their existence. This internal slowing was accompanied by a host of subtle but unmistakable external symptoms, a visible record of the body's quiet rebellion against the sustained deprivation. The skin of the settlers, which had been weathered and tanned by their long journey across the plains, now took on a pale, pasty quality, a looseness that hinted at the loss of the subcutaneous fat that had provided a necessary layer of insulation against the cold. Small cuts and scrapes, which would have healed quickly and cleanly in a state of good health, now lingered for weeks, often becoming inflamed and resistant to the simple herbal remedies they applied. A more specific and alarming symptom began to appear in the form of bleeding gums and a loosening of the teeth, a classic sign of the scurvy that resulted from a complete lack of the ascorbic acid found in fresh fruits and vegetables, a deficiency that was an unavoidable consequence of their monotonous diet of preserved meats and refined grains. The joints of the adults began to ache with a dull, persistent throb that had nothing to do with arthritis or overexertion, but was another manifestation of this systemic breakdown of the body's connective tissues. Their hair became brittle and lost its luster, and their eyes, which had once been sharp and observant, now often appeared dull and unfocused, as if the effort of truly seeing the world around them was simply too great. The psychological effects of this physical decline were equally profound, though less easily defined. Memory became less reliable, and the ability to concentrate on any single task for an extended period was diminished. The emotional landscape flattened into a narrow and monotonous range, a state of being that was not one of sadness or despair. For such active emotions required an energy they no longer possessed, but rather one of profound and unshakable indifference. The future, with its abstract promise of a spring planting and a summer harvest, became an almost meaningless concept, as the mental horizon contracted to encompass only the immediate and overwhelming present, the need for the next meal, the imperative of keeping the fire going, the simple act of enduring the next hour. This shared, unspoken decline was a quiet and isolating experience for each individual. Yet it was also a collective condition, a silent epidemic of malnutrition and exhaustion that was visible in the face of every neighbor, a shared fragility that was never directly acknowledged, but that now formed the grim and unspoken context for every interaction within the beleaguered community. The quiet and insidious decline of the human inhabitants was directly and tragically mirrored in the condition of their remaining livestock. The small collection of oxen, milk cows, and horses that represented the community's single most valuable capital asset and the primary engine of their future hopes. The animals, confined to their crude three-sided sod shelters, endured a parallel and equally severe trial of starvation and exposure, their large, stoic bodies serving as a living barometer of the settlement's dwindling fortunes. The daily observation of these creatures became a somber ritual for the men, a morning assessment that was part of their routine, but that now carried the heavy weight of an economic and existential crisis. The most dramatic and visible evidence of their shared plight was the physical transformation of the oxen, the massive beasts of burden that had pulled their wagons across a continent, the powerful, rounded muscles that had defined their shoulders and haunches had slowly wasted away, revealing the sharp, prominent ridges of their hip bones and the stark, ladder-like structure of their ribs beneath their thick, matted winter coats. Their movements, once characterized by a slow and implacable strength, were now marked by a listless and ponderous weakness, and when they were led from their shelters to the well to drink, they walked with a slow, unsteady gait, their great heads hanging low to the ground. Their eyes, which had once been placid and patient, now had a dull, sunken quality, a look of profound and animal weariness that seemed to reflect the same apathy that was settling upon their human masters. This decline was a matter of the most serious practical concern, for the settlers knew that the success of their entire venture depended on the ability of these oxen to break the thick, virgin sod of the prairie once the spring thaw arrived. And a simple visual assessment was enough to confirm that in their current state, the animals would be wholly incapable of performing such arduous labor. The condition of the few remaining milk cows was an even more immediate and painful measure of the community's decline, as their well-being was directly linked to the diet of the youngest children. Milk, which in the early weeks of the settlement had been a reliable, if modest, source of essential fats and nutrients, had now dwindled to a near useless trickle. The process of the morning milking, once a reassuring domestic chore, had become a disheartening and almost futile exercise, yielding only a small quantity of a thin, bluish-white liquid that was noticeably lacking in the richness of cream. This decline was a direct result of the animals' own starvation diet, which now consisted of little more than the dry, coarse prairie grass that the men gathered on days when the weather was calm enough to permit such work. The last of the precious hay that had been harvested in the late autumn had been consumed weeks ago, and the settlers had been forced to resort to feeding their animals a substance that provided bulk but little in the way of real nutrition, a diet that could sustain life but not productive function. The daily task of providing water for the animals was a significant expenditure of human energy, as it required melting vast quantities of snow in large iron kettles over the fire, a process that consumed a great deal of their scarce fuel. The unspoken and terrible calculus that now occupied the minds of the men as they tended to their skeletal livestock was the question of diminishing returns. The animals were consuming the community's resources, human labor and fuel, but were providing almost nothing in return, and the prospect of their eventual death from starvation before the spring grass emerged was becoming a near certainty. The ultimate and most desperate option, the slaughter of one of the oxen for its meat, was a thought that was never spoken aloud, for it represented a fundamental surrender, the sacrificing of the future for the temporary relief of the present. And so, the settlers continued the grim and laborious routine of keeping their animals alive, a daily act of faith that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Their shared suffering in the cold, dark shelters, a silent and constant testament to the razor-thin margin that now separated survival from complete and irreversible failure. The first harbinger of the profound change that was to come was not a visual cue, for the landscape remained an unbroken and monolithic expanse of white, but was instead an auditory phenomenon, a sound so subtle and unfamiliar that it, initially, registered only on the periphery of the settler's dulled consciousness. It was the sound of a single drop of water, a soft, resonant plink that occurred at an irregular and unpredictable interval somewhere in the dark earthen wall of the dugout, a sound that was utterly alien to the crisp, silent physics of the deep freeze that had governed their world for months. This solitary, acoustic event was the leading edge of a vast and inexorable meteorological shift. The slow turning of the great continental wheel of the seasons, as a persistent Chinook wind, a warm and desiccating current of air flowing down from the distant mountains, began to exert its influence over the frozen plains. The settlers, long accustomed to reading the subtle language of their environment, noted this change not as a single event, but as a collection of small, accumulating signs. The wind, which for months had been a consistently sharp and biting force, from the north now shifted to the west, and it carried with it not the familiar sting of ice crystals, but a softer, gentler quality, a feeling of relative warmth that was less a comfort and more a profound and unsettling strangeness. The quality of the daylight, which filtered through the greased paper windows, also underwent a transformation, losing the hard, brilliant glare of sunlight reflecting off dry snow and taking on a softer, more diffuse and watery luminescence, as the very air itself became saturated with a higher degree of humidity. Inside the dugouts, the thick layer of frost that had coated the upper walls and the ceiling near the entrance began to weep. The intricate, feathery patterns of ice slowly losing their structure and dissolving into slow, trickling rivulets of water that traced dark, meandering paths down the packed earth walls. This gradual thaw initiated a new and deeply unpleasant phase of their existence, as the very structure of their shelters, which had been so effective as an insulator against the dry cold, now revealed its fundamental flaw in the face of moisture. The roof, a composite structure of wood, brush, grass, and a thick, heavy layer of sod, had been rendered into a single, solid, and largely impermeable block by the deep frost. Now, as the temperatures slowly climbed above the freezing point, this entire frozen mass began a slow and uneven process of melting, not just from the top down, due to the warming air, but also from the bottom up, from the constant, low-grade heat that emanated from the stove within the dugout. The consequence of this dual-front thaw was the transformation of the roof into a saturated, sponge-like mass, which, once its capacity to hold water was exceeded, began to release its contents into the living space below. The phenomenon did not begin as a dramatic leak, but as a slow, monotonous, and inescapable dripping. The water that percolated through the feet of sod and decaying prairie grass was not clean, but was a thick, brown, viscous liquid, a cold tea brewed from earth and roots that fell in fat, heavy drops onto the floor. The bedding and the inhabitants themselves. The placement of these drips was random and unpredictable. A spot that was dry 1 hour could become an active leak the next, forcing a constant and wearying rearrangement of the dugout's interior. Every available pot, pan, and wooden bucket was strategically positioned to catch the relentless drips, and the sound of this irregular, multi-point percussion became the new and maddening soundtrack of their lives, a constant reminder of the slow, dirty dissolution of the barrier that separated them from the outside world. The packed turf floors, which had been as hard as stone when frozen, now softened into a slick, greasy mud, a substance that clung to their boots and the hems of their clothing and seemed to permeate every surface, further degrading the already marginal standards of cleanliness. The bedding, which they constantly struggled to reposition to avoid the drips, became perpetually damp, a cold and clammy state that offered no real rest and that seemed to draw the heat from their already weary bodies. This new reality was, in many ways, more demoralizing than the severe cold it had replaced. The cold had been a clean, hard, and definable enemy that could be fought with fire and insulation. But this pervasive, seeping dampness was an insidious and formless adversary that could not be walled out, a slow, filthy, and dispiriting invasion of their last remaining sanctuary. The world that was revealed to the pioneers as they emerged from the damp semi-darkness of their subterranean shelters was not the green and promising landscape of their eastward-looking imaginations, but a vast and almost featureless panorama of brown and gray, a study in the stark and melancholy beauty of a land caught in the liminal state between two seasons. The immense, uniform blanket of snow had not vanished in a clean and orderly retreat, but had collapsed into a pockmarked and rotten mass, a chaotic topography of soiled, granular ice and standing pools of glacial meltwater that reflected the washed-out, overcast sky with a dull, leaden sheen. The ground itself, the rich prairie soil from which they were expected to carve a future, was now a boundless expanse of deep, viscous, and profoundly impassable mud, a substance so thick and clinging that it sucked at their boots with every laborious step, making even the short journey from the dugout door to the communal well a significant and exhausting undertaking. The familiar, snow-walled pathways that had connected their small community throughout the winter had dissolved, their defining trenches now filled with a slushy brown slurry, and the entire settlement now appeared as a collection of isolated, semi-submerged mounds of earth, each a small and lonely island in a great, silent sea of mud. The air itself had a new and unfamiliar density, heavy with the raw, organic scent of thawing earth. A smell that was not yet the fragrant promise of spring, but the more primitive and unsettling odor of a world undergoing a slow and messy process of decomposition and rebirth. The skeletons of the livestock, still shockingly thin, but having miraculously survived the winter, stood listlessly in their crude enclosures, their hooves sunk deep into the mire, their coats matted with a mixture of mud and shedding winter, hair, their heads bowed as if in contemplation of the sheer effort that would be required to move through this new and resistant medium. This was the landscape of their deliverance from the winter, and it offered not a sense of relief, but a sober and overwhelming intimation of the immense scale of the labor that lay ahead, a recognition that the end of one trial was merely the prelude to the beginning of another, one that would be fought not against the clean, elemental force of the cold, but against the stubborn, yielding, and soul-crushing inertia of the saturated earth. The first task of this new era was the methodical assessment of their tools, a ritual that was undertaken with a grim and silent purpose by the men of the community. The breaking plows, which had been left partially exposed to the elements, were coated in a thick layer of rust, and a full day was spent carefully disassembling, cleaning, and oiling their moving parts. The metallic scrape of the wire brushes a new sound in the quiet, damp air. The first attempt to put one of these plows to its intended use was a moment of quiet, unspoken drama, the culmination of their entire journey, and the first real test of their future viability. Two of the strongest remaining oxen, their bones still starkly visible beneath their hides, were yoked together and positioned before the plow, their great cloven hooves sinking deep into the mud. The plowshare, sharpened to a fine edge, was set against the sod, and at a low command from the farmer, the animals strained forward, their muscles bunching in a display of what little strength they had left. For a moment, the plow held fast, resisted by the incredibly dense and tangled root system of the virgin prairie grass, a network of fibers that had been growing, undisturbed, for millennia. Then, with a great sucking groan, the sod yielded, and a single, thick, dark ribbon of earth, about a foot wide, was peeled back, exposing the rich, black soil beneath. It was a victory, but one that was almost immediately negated by the reality of the effort it had required. The oxen were left trembling and winded after pulling the plow for only a few feet, and the men knew that to break a single acre in this manner would take days of such grueling inch by inch progress. The future was visible in that single dark furrow, and it was a future that would be defined not by a heroic conquest of the wilderness, but by a slow, monotonous, and almost unimaginably arduous war of attrition against the land itself. A struggle for which the long, dark winter had been only the first and most basic period of training. As the weight of sleep slowly closes your eyelids, let your imagination wander through the ages in your dreams. If you enjoyed the video, I invite you to like it. There are more boring history stories to help you fall asleep. See you at bedtime. Goodbye.